Good morning, everyone. Please join me as we say a blessing for study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. This morning's class, which we're recording for those of you who are watching it not in real time, but after the fact, today is Thursday, May 11th. We'll continue our discussion of a signature Talmudic passage that entertains the subject of the causes and responses to suffering. We just by way of recap, since for those of us who are doing this in real time, it's been 2 weeks since we learned together. Well, 3 weeks, really. The chief notion that has been introduced over the last few weeks is this idea in Hebrew of Yisurin shel Ahava, an affliction that comes from love. The theological implication being that if a person is suffering, it can mean only one of three things. One, that it's an affliction of punishment for a transgression. Two, that it is an affliction of love, that in fact the person is suffering not despite the fact that he is or she is righteous, but because of it, and that it is a sign of favor or merit. I recognize how theologically challenging that notion is for, I would go out on a limb and say for all of us. Nevertheless, that is the signature notion we've been exploring over the last few weeks. The third possibility is one that the rabbis reject out of hand, but it's worth bringing up anyway, which is that there is no meaning to suffering. For those of us living in a post-Holocaust reality, and this would not be the first time we've made mention of this over the last few weeks, it is entirely plausible to conclude there is no meaning to the question of suffering, that it is not, it has nothing to do with whether one is being afflicted through punishment or afflicted through love. It just is. I've probably shown my cards enough for you to surmise that I fall mostly into that camp. Though my framework is that, the universe is simply not calibrated to human notions of fairness. Suffering is our perception of the reality of the world, and it is not a comment on whether or not God loves us. But that's my theology. You didn't come here for my theology. You came here to study Talmud. So that's what I think we should do. Once we introduce this notion of Yisurin shel Ahava, a affliction that is caused not by punishment, or not as punishment, but rather as an expression of love, however twisted that may seem, we then got into the granular dimension of the text, looking at exactly what kinds of suffering qualify as Yisurin shel Ahava. And the two major categories are disease, specifically leprosy, which probably refers to any number of dreadful skin conditions that the Bible describes by symptom, but obviously doesn't have modern medical nomenclature to diagnose disease the way we do today, or children, which itself presents in two different forms, either barrenness, that is to say, one who cannot or does not have children, or the second category, one who has children who die. Having children in and of themselves, even if they are a pain in the tuchus, is not what the rabbis are referring to when they talk about suffering brought about by children. They're not talking about a kid who gives you a hard time. They're talking about either infertility, barrenness, inability to have children, or having children and then having children who die. So these two broad categories called leprosy and children define the two major categories of suffering that the rabbis are thinking about when they talk about Yisurin shel Ahava. suffering that might not be an affliction brought as punishment, but rather as a demonstration of God's love. And again, I'm not asking you to accept the theological premises that the rabbis are presenting, merely to understand them. You know, we're here to learn. Having said that, I think we're going to go to a very deep place today, and maybe even for those of you who have been suffering through the journey of exploring these texts, maybe, just maybe, you'll find something that gives you just a little bit of comfort. I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, generally, or today. I never like to overpromise and underdeliver, but I'm anticipating that some of you will actually like where this goes, perhaps more than you like where it has gone. Okay, so that's my preamble for the morning. We've blessed, so I'm going to bring on screen, the text from Sepharia. I can't remember exactly where we left off, but I think it's somewhere around here. This is Tractate Berakhot, that is to say, the very first tractate of the Talmud. Tractate Berakhot, page 5b. We started on 5a and we're just reading sequentially. So let's, even if this is going back a little bit, we'll start at the top of the screen. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan said, Nigaim uvanim. Those are the two categories. Nigaim, which they translate here as leprosy. Honestly, I'm not convinced that they mean only the kinds of skin diseases that the Bible categorizes as leprosy. There is a specific word that is often translated as leprosy. That is the word sara'at. Sara'at refers to dreaded skin conditions that the Bible speaks about extensively in Leviticus chapters 13 and 14 and 15. This word is not sara'at. This word is nigaim. A nega is a broader term. It doesn't only mean leprosy. It means a plague. It actually comes from the root nun gimel ayin, or actually I think it's gimel ayin ayin, gimel ayin tav. I'm not sure. If Jane Roberts were here, we could have fun figuring out the Hebrew root. The root of nigaim is laga'at, which means to touch. So an affliction, right? Something that touches you. Banim is much more straightforward Hebrew word. Banim means children. So nigaim, the plagues and the children, einan yisurin shelahava. So Rabbi Yochanan's declaration here is that disease, we'll just translate it disease generally, and suffering due to children, as Steinsaltz interpolates here. Remember that the bold print is what is actually in the text, and the plain print in the translation is what Steinsaltz has interpolated to help the reader understand, but it is very much interpretation and not just strict translation. So disease and children, meaning the suffering that is brought about by both, but where children, as I've just qualified a few minutes ago, means not having or having and losing to death. These are not afflictions that are brought about through God's love for the one who suffers. And then it goes on to say, Unegaim la, how is disease not an affliction of love? As Steinsaltz interpolates here. Didn't we learn, Vihatanya, which means didn't we learn in the Mishnah, or in the Mishnaic era, they cite a Baraita, which is an extra Mishnaic passage, as we've said many times, contemporaneous with the Mishnah, meaning the early stratum of rabbinic writing, but not encoded, not codified into the Mishnah. Anyone who has one of the four signs of disease, halalu, one of these four signs of disease, einan, that can be nothing other than ela mizbach kapara, an altar of atonement. So there is an additional notion that is now introduced here, that to suffer from disease is a means of expiation from sin. So, and again, you have to understand that these theological notions arise from, deep contemplation of the human condition. So a person who is afflicted with disease with no rhyme or reason, which is often how disease goes, and particularly in the ancient world where, disease was kind of an ever-present and much dreaded fact of life, without the aid of modern medical science to understand why people get sick. And even today, not every disease has an explanation. Some people get cancer just because they get cancer. They didn't do anything. They didn't, inhale or ingest any environmental toxins. They did everything right and they still get cancer. A notion is introduced here that a person who is suffering from disease, at least of the sort that Leviticus 13 identifies, is also being cleansed of his sin. So disease is purifying of one's soul, even as it ravages one's body. Now, whether or not that means that is a demonstration of God's love for the afflicted is what is being discussed here. As it continues, Mizbach kapara havu. So it's an altar of atonement, yes. That's literally what these three words mean. Mizbach kapara, an altar of atonement, havu, sure, yes. Yisurin shel ahava, but is it an affliction of love? La havu, not so much. I'll read the Steinsaltz just so you can let that marinate. The Gemara answers, although the signs of leprosy are an altar of atonement for one's transgressions, they are not an affliction of love. In other words, the expiatory function of suffering, the way in which suffering, as the rabbis here are claiming, cleanses one of sin or expiates one's sin, makes atonement for one's sin, nevertheless is not a demonstration of the cause of the suffering. It is only an explanation of the effect of the suffering. Does that make sense? Right? You can have one, but not the other. The rabbis make this bold theological claim that to suffer, in this case from disease, is to have your sins negated. Blank slate. You've suffered enough for whatever you did. There is no transgression, so grievous that, hideous afflictions of the skin aren't sufficient punishment. Thinking in still this ancient Deuteronomic, that is to say, modeled after the theology of the book of Deuteronomy, biblical notion of measure for measure, reward and punishment, that a person gets what he deserves for one's conduct. So the idea here is that if you suffer these awful, hard to treat skin diseases that the book of Leviticus spills oceans of ink describing in over many chapters, enough already. You've paid the price for whatever you possibly could have done wrong. But that speaks of the effect of the suffering. The suffering has this purifying, cleansing, or expiatory is the word I use, the word that literally means to make atonement, to expiate, function. That's what suffering does. The rabbis are saying here that should be differentiated from what causes the suffering. That doesn't necessarily mean that God brought it about in order to acknowledge the righteousness of a specific person. So those are the subtle differentiations that the text is making here. We're going to read just a little bit more, and then, of course, I'll make time for questions and comments, because I recognize this is challenging both intellectually and especially theologically, spiritually, and emotionally. Reading on, V'i ba'etema, and if you like, you could say, this is a customary Talmudic phrase or formula that introduces, here's a new way of thinking of things. V'i ba'etema, and if you like, you could say, ha lan v'ha lehu. Look at, by the way, how terse the Talmud is compared to how Steinsaltz unpacks it. Steinsaltz needs to give you like a huge paragraph to explain what looks to my eye as 7 words. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? The ibayetema halan v'halehu. And if you wish, you could say instead, this halan means this is for us, v'halehu means and that is for them. So again, what does the text actually say? The text actually says, if you need a way of thinking about this, if you need to understand this, consider that is for them and this is for us. Who are them? Who are us? What is that? And what is this? This is why the Talmud is such a difficult text to read. That's for them and this is for us. Let's see how Steinsaltz gets us to a deeper understanding or an understanding at all. This, meaning this teaching, this baraita, which says that leprosy is an affliction of love, is for us, meaning it applies for us here in diaspora. Remember, the Talmudic rabbis are writing in Babylonia. That is why it is called the Babylonian Talmud. Because outside of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, we are not as careful of the laws of ritual impurity. And one afflicted with leprosy may interact with others, which mitigates his suffering. They're not talking about communicable disease. They're talking about the fact that in Eretz Yisrael, where the biblical laws are observed more stringently, that's the operating premise here. A person who is identified with any of these skin conditions has to be quarantined, strictly isolated. Just think back to 2020, okay? We've all lived through this now. This is it may not be a very relatable text, but it is much more relatable in 2023 than it was in 2019. So hooray that we're studying it today and not 4 years ago. In biblical law, which the rabbis are claiming is observed more stringently in the land of Israel, the leper, I don't love that term, but the person who's afflicted with any of these diseases has to be removed from the community and strictly quarantined for up to 7 days or more with a check by the Kohen, the priest, on day 7. And if the symptoms have been remediated in any meaningful way, then he can come back to the community after bathing and washing and shaving and all that stuff. They're saying that here in Babylonia, we do not observe the biblical law around disease as strictly. And the suffering is mitigated because one is not strictly quarantined outside the community and therefore at least can keep company with people. And if any of you have ever been sick or hospitalized, in addition to whatever physical ailments are getting you down, it is, I think, universally true, at least in my experience as a pastor, one who visits people who are sick with regularity, particularly in hospitals. And again, think pre-COVID. Let's not talk about the way in which COVID made this even harder, though actually that is a meaningful additional lens through which to view this challenge. Not having company, that is to say loneliness, isolation, deeply exaggerates the suffering of one who is sick. And that's why, by the way, one of the core mitzvot of the Jewish tradition, one that although it is performed by people, is nevertheless ascribed to God as a godly behavior, is bikur cholim, visiting the sick. I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint because I like building suspense. That's where this text is going today. We're going to talk not only about suffering, but what gives comfort when one is sick. Okay, that's why I think this is going to be a text that most of us can really get behind, even if the theological claims that have been made in the last page and change have challenged or vexed us. We're really going to be talking a lot about not only the physical dimension of suffering, but also the way in which the presence of another human being or other people is one powerful and primary way to alleviate suffering. So what they're saying is, well, in Babylonia, we don't observe the rules as stringently as they did in Bible times and in Bible place, meaning Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, we allow a little bit more visitation when a person has these, terrible diseases, and therefore the suffering is not as bad here as it is over there. That's what this text is saying, just completing what Steinsaltz has to say about it. And that statement of Rabbi Yochanan that leprosy is not an affliction of love applies for them in Eretz Yisrael, where they are exceedingly careful of the laws of ritual impurity. Excuse me. And the suffering of a leper is great because he is banished from society. That is an interpretation that is provided by Adin Steinsaltz of blessed memory, the great 20th and 21st century Talmud scholar, but comes from Rav Hai Gaon, who, if I'm not mistaken, was writing over 1,000 years ago, but I need to check that. One of the great Babylonian sages, a post-Talmudic sage, but one of the great extrapolators and interpreters of the Talmud. Okay, reading on a bit. The ibayetema, or you could say, and if you wish you could say, ha b'tzin'ah ha b'farhesia. So this is a separate interpretation. Maybe they're playing in a very rabbinic way with why is there a discrepancy, right? Why do the rabbis disagree about this? And how can we harmonize the disagreement? How can we make it so that, you know what, you're both right. The Baraita's opinion and Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, you're both right. You both have a valid point. It's just that you have to apply your 2 points differently in order for both points to remain valid. If you wish, you can say instead, this Baraita, which says that leprosy is an affliction of love, refers to concealed leprosy. In other words, the leprosy that is only afflicting like your chest and your back and your tuchus and all the parts of the body that you don't see when you are clothed. But that statement, meaning Rabbi Yochanan's opposing comment, refers to visible leprosy. And helpfully, Steinsaltz says that causes those who see it to distance themselves from the leper, right? Because, again, the disease causes physical suffering. But there is also the important dimension of social isolation or being ostracized or mocked or humiliated by having to walk out in public with a dreadful skin condition all over the visible parts of your body, your face, your hands, your feet, what have you. That will draw unwanted attention to the sufferer, and it will magnify that person's suffering. Do you understand how they're doing this? Okay. I think that's the section up to which I want to get where we take comments. Yeah, and now we're going to get into a pretty wild set of ma'asim, or stories, that are going to take us to the end of today's study, and possibly into next week, but I think we have an hour, and the storytelling will fit into an hour. I'd love to hear any questions or comments on anything we've learned thus far in the first 25, 30 minutes of our class today. Mom and Dad, you can go first.
Notably absent is any notion of proportionality here.
Right.
I mean, maybe what I need to atone for is the fact that I mixed wool and linen in my garment. Why do I have leprosy?
Right. Well, yes. And I'm not sure that I wouldn't want you to quote me on this, but I'm going to try and use my best recollection from rabbinical school days and my best application of rabbinic logic. There are plenty of transgressions that have a mechanism of remediation through the Jewish court system, through the rabbinical court system, through a Beit Din, right? So we're not really talking about infractions that would come with a criminal penalty, right? So this is not, the expectation is not that if you murder your neighbor or assault your wife or, God forbid, cause some kind of harm that the Bible or the rabbinic law specifically stipulates comes with a criminal penalty, whether it is karet, which means being cut off from one's community, or cherem, which is full excommunication, or even death, the death penalty. All of those apply when there is a case of harm inflicted that the Jewish court system could regulate. So we really, I think, are talking about infractions in the ritual domain. As you said, I mixed wool and linen. I got up on the morning of Yom Kippur and ate a bowl of olives before I realized that it was the Day of Atonement. And remember, you can only have up to one olive's bulk of food before you have transgressed. My guess, or I forgot to make a sacrifice, or I improperly tithed. In other words, I think we're talking about punishments for, or even, I'm not sure if this is like exactly into thought police, because the Talmud will later affirm that, aver that you can't be punished for what you think. But let's say you make a vow to God of such and so, and then you fail to fulfill it. But things that have no external mechanism of enforcement. The rabbis are conjecturing here that those kinds of sins, in other words, what we would call ben adam lamakom, between a person and his maker, between a person and God, this is the way in which God punishes and which sin is expiated.
Still doesn't answer the question of
Proportionality, right? But that's highly subjective. I mean, to you, wearing woolen linen may be a sin far less grievous than failing to pay your tithe to the priest. But I'm not sure the rabbi saw it that way.
Well, not to get all rabbinic on you,
by all means.
but it seems like kal v'homer should apply here.
Yes, I agree.
If there's a minor transgression of a ritual nature, it seems to me that so much more so should that person deserve leprosy. I mean,
right.
That's where I'm stumbling on this rock, John.
I appreciate that. Stumble away. I'll stumble with you because you're right. The text does not address the question of proportionality. Thank you, Audrey.
Did you say somewhere along the line that if you're suffering, that makes you wipe away your sin?
Well, I said that that's what the rabbis are trying to communicate here.
But wouldn't it?
Suffering has a cleansing effect for one's transgressions.
On the other hand, couldn't it make you still so angry that you really don't cleanse yourself?
Sure.
I mean, you don't have to accept that you're being punished.
That's right.
It might just make you
angry. And anyone who wants to persist in a state of righteous anger that one's suffering is not warranted or is not commensurate, or my dad's word, proportional to whatever transgression one may have transgressed, one has a very good kind of archetype in the figure of Job. That is the story of Job, right? The book of Job, interestingly, the book of Job, which predates Talmudic writing by centuries, at least 5 or 6 centuries before the beginning of the Mishnah. I shouldn't say that. 4 to 5 centuries before the beginning of the Mishnah, the book of Job enters the canon. Very influenced by Greek wisdom literature, by the way, and written in a strange poetic dialect of Hebrew that's inflected with loanwords from Greek and Aramaic. So that makes most people think that Job is a fairly late book in the canon, but it is still centuries BCE, right? All biblical literature was completed before Jesus ever walked the earth. That's our barometer because that's when we start counting years with 0. So the book of Job, centuries before the rabbis ever raised these issues, the book of Job full-throatedly rejects the notion of measure for measure, reward and punishment. The book of Job is the righteous sufferer who says, whatever I did wrong, and by the way, I've done nothing wrong. That's Job's claim. Whatever I may have done wrong, and by the way, I did nothing wrong, I don't deserve what's happening to me. His friends, and I always use that word in quote, Job's friends, friends like this, as they say,
fair weather friends.
Enemies. His friends try to comfort him by saying, well, buddy, I don't know, but you must have done something pretty bad because God's pretty pissed at you because look at how much you're suffering. And Job basically says, it doesn't work that way. I refuse to accept that it works that way. And then he demands an answer. I mean, 38 chapters of demanding an answer and lamenting his suffering, but good for him. Till God finally shows up in the 38th chapter out of the whirlwind and says, what do you know?
Very unsatisfying.
It's a well, for many, yeah, I find it highly satisfying, but that's just because as literature,
Oh.
as theology, I'm not sure. Okay, Judy.
This is also difficult to think about and accept, but could it be someone who is suffering says, oh, I am suffering because God loves me. This is an expression of God's love. It would alleviate the pain.
Yeah, I think that that's a workaround that is provided in this text as the alternative to suffering that is punishment or expiation. The alternative the rabbis provide is that suffering is a demonstration of love. You know, who was it? Billy Joel, only the good die young, right? God only gives you what you can take. This idea that the righteous suffer more acutely, and that in fact it's not a stain of being marked as a transgressor, but rather a badge of honor. I'm so righteous, and that's why I suffer. Again, what the rabbis don't provide here is the theological claim that comes to the fore in modern Jewish thought, particularly post-Holocaust Jewish thought, which is that suffering is meaningless. You know, there is no cause of suffering other than it is. Yeah, right. Michelle Braun, a badge I could do without. Thank you very much. Steve Maskett, please.
So the discussion about Job is interesting to me because this debate within the text that we've just read seems to separate in the land of Israel, in Eretz Israel, and outside, sort of a diaspora solution to the, but it doesn't directly address the Jobian problem, but it seems that somehow it works around it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, remember, Job actually didn't live in the land of Israel. He's from a place called Uz, usually written in English, U-Z. I don't know where Uz is. I have to look it up on a map. I guess the La Brea tar pits are Uz, but that's of a different sort. So yeah, but I mean, I would say just separately, it is interesting that the rabbis are showing the way in which they selectively or differently apply Jewish law and Jewish phenomenology for the diaspora versus the land of Israel. This is a thread you can see throughout rabbinic literature, that things are different for us in diaspora than they are or were in Eretz Yisrael. And the idea of Eretz Yisrael is equated with Jewish ritual stringency, whereas, well, we're a little bit more lax here in diaspora, is another common theme, and it does emerge in this text as well. I want to acknowledge Barbara's comment in the chat box about the word kapara, which is the word for atonement, and of course is related to the word Kippur, as in Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Kapara means atonement. It's also kaporos or kaparot, the plural of kapara, meaning atonements or expiations, is the name given to the ritual of transferring the sins of the Jewish community onto the head of a chicken, swinging it over your head, reciting some kind of ritual incantation, and then decapitating the chicken and Shabbos dinner for the poor. Hooray. What else can I say? Yeah, the idea, though, the word kapara, atonement, actually comes from a root meaning to cover up, to conceal, not actually to destroy or get rid of. So on Yom Kippur, all of our sins are covered over. It's kind of wild. Also, the kaporet in the ancient tabernacle is the name given to the curtain that would conceal the Holy of Holies, right? So there's a lot of imagery and allusion to ancient temple practice in the present day language and ceremony surrounding Yom Kippur. Arlene Goldsmith.
I don't know if the Talmud even tackles this, but we are aware now in modern times that there are some diseases that have a genetic core. And so we may see various family members suffering from the same disease.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if at any point, to your knowledge, do they tackle this when it becomes a whole family unit that suffers?
I don't know.
Okay.
Don't. And they probably, if so, they would have come up with different explanations for why.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's really interesting though. I mean, generally it's like that old who was the tomato sauce whose slogan was "It's in there"? Wasn't that Ragu? It was either Ragu or Prego. It was one of those jarred sauces, and their slogan in the 70s or 80s was "It's in there." Yeah, that's how I feel about the Talmud. It's in there. I'm sure it's in there. Okay, let's continue because now things get really interesting. I mean, they've been interesting, have they not? Okay, good. The Gemara continues to object, and suffering due to children is not an affliction of love? How could that not be? In other words, if a child dies, how could that possibly be linked to a transgression? That's what they're really asking. If the only two choices are, I suffer because I transgressed, or I suffer because it's a badge of my righteousness and how much God loves me, where suffering is meaningless is not an option in the theological restrictions that the rabbis operate under. If those are the only two choices, love or punishment, then the death of a child? How could that be? What sin? Particularly, as my dad points out on the proportionality question, what sin could possibly warrant the death of a child? Okay, what are the Gemara clarifies, so what are the circumstances? If you say that he had children and they died, so that's the circumstance that I'm talking about here. Didn't Rabbi Yochanan himself say, and remember, he's the one who raises the objection at the beginning of the sugya we looked at today. Didn't Rabbi Yochanan himself say, while consoling the victim of a catastrophe, this is the bone of my 10th son? Okay, now this is, remember I said we're going to look at a ma'aseh, or as we still carry the word in the Yiddish language, a meise. All right, a meise means a happening. Something that actually happened, or probably the best English translation is an anecdote. But meise has so much color to it, and anecdote doesn't. The most famous application of a meise, of course, in Yiddish is a baba meise, meaning a grandmother's anecdote, usually referring to some scientifically specious piece of advice or superstition that is conveyed from generation to generation. But when called a baba meise, it is somewhat being debunked as actually effective or authoritative, right? Okay. So baba meise, but a meise broadly is simply a reference to a Talmudic device in which a case is made through the actual doings of one of the sages, as opposed to what a sage teaches, right? So there are the sage's words, which constitute, I would say, the preponderance of Talmudic argument is words, words, words. It's rabbis making arguments, making their case with words. But often, to substantiate a case or even to make a case, a meise or a ma'aseh is brought. So we're going to learn several ma'asim, several meises that pertain to Rabbi Yochanan now. And the anecdote requires that you understand that Rabbi Yochanan had many children, and according to this legend, he buried 10 of them. This is not unheard of, by the way, in the ancient world, though whenever you see the number 10, like a few other numbers, 7 in particular, in Jewish lore, you should probably not assume that it is numerically significant. It is a literary device. It's what we call an etiological number. 10 just means a whole bunch, a lot. 40 days and 40 nights. It's not that we're literally counting 40 days. It's a long time. Moses was up on Mount Sinai 40 days and 40 nights. The ark was on the water 40 days and it rained 40 days and 40 nights when Noah was on the ark. Okay, a long time. Many, many children died. And Rabbi Yochanan apparently, and this is really morbid, but apparently he carried like a small bone around and he would use it to console people. I have not adopted any such practice in my rabbinate. I think that would freak people out. Like if I have been present for people who've been in the blackest hole of grief when a child has died. So you have to kind of just suspend your disbelief, or worse, that Rabbi Yochanan thought that it would be comforting to produce the bone of one of his children and say, well, consider it's not so bad, or yeah, you're not the only one. Here's my kid. Okay, it's weird, but you just go with it. We're getting somewhere, I promise you. But sometimes you got to wade through the weird. All right, this is the bone of my 10th son. And Steinsaltz tells you this because this is what is explained in other literature. So Steinsaltz helpfully brings it all to the forefront. Rabbi Yochanan experienced the death of 10 of his children, and he kept a small bone from his 10th child as a painful memorial. He would show that bone to others in order to console them. And since he showed it to them, the deaths of his children must certainly have been an affliction of love. He consoled others by displaying that there is an element of intimacy with God that exists in that suffering. That is in Tosafot. Tosafot, a new word. I'm not sure we've seen this one before. Tosafot means additional, or the additional stuff. It refers to a body of Talmudic commentary produced in the 12th century, 12th and 13th century, by a rabbinic community in France, including Rashi's own grandchildren. The Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, and Rabbeinu Tam, T-A-M, not T-O-M. Rabbeinu Tam and the Rashbam and their company were among a group of Talmudic scholars in northern France in the 12th century known as the Tosafot, the Adderons, or the adders-on, those who enhanced or enlarged the commentary. It is a bit confusing because there is also a body of text that we have talked about called the Tosefta. Tosefta also means additional. It's just the Aramaic form. So Tosefta, add-on, Tosafot, add-on, but they're 1,000 years apart. The Tosefta is a body of extra Mishnaic teachings contemporaneous with the Mishnah, a lot like the Berakhot, the Baraitas, early 1st, 2nd, 3rd century of the Common Era, also referenced in the Talmud. The Tosafot are not in the Gemara, right? The Gemara is made up of the Mishnah, and then the Tanaim, the early teachers, and the Amoraim, and the Savoraim. The Tanaim, the early teachers, the Amoraim, the middle teachers, 400, 500 CE, 300, 400, 500 CE, and the Savoraim, 600, 700, maybe even as late as 800 of the Common Era. That's the Talmud, Mishnah and Gemara. But if you buy a Talmud today, particularly a traditional, what's known as a Vilna Shas, meaning the Vilna edition from Vilnius, Lithuania, which was printed toward the end of the 19th century, which became the definitive edition of the Talmud in the Ashkenazi world. When you buy a Vilna Shas, it will include the Gemara in the middle, but then it has lots of commentary around the margins. The inside margin is always Rashi. Why? Well, the Baba Meises goes like this. Suppose you're walking to the yeshiva with a volume of Talmud under your arm, and you slip and you drop it in a mud puddle, and the binding opens like this. Rashi will be the last one to get wet. That's the idea. Rashi's always on the inside, closer to the binding. The outside are the Tosafot. So they are not as venerated as Rashi's commentary. Nevertheless, they are an important layer of Talmudic understanding. You got Rashi writing in the 11th century, and then the generation of and including his actual grandchildren, 12th century, northern France, Tosafot. So Steinsaltz is simply telling us that what we're looking at here comes from Tosafot. There's an element of intimacy with God that exists in that suffering. Why then would Rabbi Yochanan have said that suffering due to children is not affliction of love? Rather, and this is actually in the text, one must conclude that when Rabbi Yochanan said that those afflictions are not afflictions of love, he was speaking with regard to one who has no children, But when one had children who died, this could very well be considered afflictions of love. And remember I said, the Talmud speaks in this extremely laconic way. Laconic means with lots of gaps. In other words, there are things you want the Talmud to say, and they're just not there, and you have to fill in the understanding. It's written in almost like a stenographic shorthand. So the Talmud would say there are two kinds of suffering that might be categorized as afflictions of love: disease, nigaim, and children, banim. And then remember, this is at the beginning of today's class, so I'm hoping I'm not jarring your memory too far back. Under the category of children, there are two subcategories. There are those who do not or cannot have children, and there are those who have children who die. They are eliminating children who die. They are eliminating, I got to go back to the text. This is so thorny and confusing. They're speaking with regard to one who has no children, is not an affliction of love. Barrenness, for instance. But the death of a child must surely be or could very well be considered an affliction of love, because as I said before, the logic problem here is, well, what transgression could you possibly come up with that could warrant the death of a child? Anyone knows. It's almost in the God forbid situations, which I am occasionally summoned to perform the funeral for a child. It's the hardest eulogy to write, because really, what is there to say? I don't have any words that are really going to comfort this family, nor should I. So you just do your best to show up and be present and loving. And generally, the cliche that can't be avoided is to affirm in the presence of the family and any other mourners or the public, if they come to grieve publicly, is that parents should not bury their children. This is not how it is supposed to be, but sometimes is. And now our in-house expert in such matters, Erin.
How is that more logical than the death of a child being an affliction of love?
I agree with you. It's only that the rabbis only give themselves one other choice, because they've eliminated the choice that this doesn't actually mean anything. That, in other words, there is no cause in the moral universe that would warrant the death of a child. They don't entertain that possibility because they believe, I think, that to do so would be to disavow the existence of God. In a world where God exists, in a world where God is benevolent, and in a world where God is omnipotent, all-powerful, the rabbis only give themselves, they've kind of painted themselves into a corner theologically, I think. They only give themselves two options: that good people suffer because they weren't that good and they did something to deserve it, or they suffer not despite the fact of how God feels about them, but because God loves them, as twisted as that seems. That's how I think it is preferable to the idea that the rabbis would say, well, there's some kind of transgression a person could have performed where the appropriate punishment would be God kills their child. But you and I think, see it similarly, that, well, no, that's still not satisfactory. Theologically, spiritually, that's not satisfactory. But that's okay. Sit with the discomfort a little longer and we'll keep going. Okay. So now we get, sometimes Steinsaltz bugs me because he tells us too much. He takes some of the fun out of it. So Steinsaltz here says, the Gemara continues to address the issue of suffering and affliction. Well, thank you very much, but we're smart people. We could have figured that out just by reading it. Okay, but that's all right. Rabbi Yochanan's student, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, fell ill. This is the first of a couple meises that we're going to learn today. So Rabbi Yochanan, remember, Rabbi Yochanan is one of the great sages of his generation, one of the first sages. This is Rabbi Yochanan, I believe, ben Zakkai. Let's see. Am I right about that? Click on his name here. Does it pop up? Oh, no, this is Rabbi Yochanan ben Napacha. See, that's why you do that. Rabbi Yochanan, second generation Amoraim, so late 3rd century. He studied under Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who half a century earlier, or a little bit less, 25, 30, 40 years earlier, had codified the Mishnah and emerged as the next leader after his death. He directed the academy in Tiberias, which is near the Galilee, in the land of Israel, and he set up the groundwork for the Jerusalem Talmud. His unusual beauty, sharpness, and personal sufferings made him a captivating yet intimidating teacher. It was due to his personality and his unrivaled learning that the center of Torah study did not move to Babylonia during his lifetime, but after he died, it did. So, okay, thank you for that helpful biographical note, Safaria. So Rabbi Yochanan, this prominent sage, had a student, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, and he got sick. Rabbi Yochanan entered to visit him and said, "Is your suffering dear to you?" This is going to be a refrain. So this story is told in Aramaic, but I'll read it a little bit. Rabbi Chia bar Abba chalash. It starts with this line. Rabbi Chia bar Abba fell ill. Without Steinsaltz, we might not know that that's Rabbi Yochanan's student. Al Lagabe Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan went to visit him, Amarle, and said to him, Chavivin alecha yisurin? Are these, again, yisurin means chastisements or sufferings. Are these sufferings chavivin? Any of you watch Fauda on Netflix? Count how many times in a single episode the term Habibi is used. All the people in the squad are always calling each other Habibi. It's both Hebrew and Arabic. It means
buddy.
It means buddy,
Pal. Yeah.
buddy or pal, but it comes from the Hebrew word chaviv, which is the same in Arabic, which means beloved, dear one, buddy, pal. But Habibi, it means my bosom buddy. It's a very intimate term, actually. Parents use it with children. It's very affectionate. Habibi. So he's saying, are your yisurin, is your suffering chaviv alecha? Do you cherish this? Are you finding an intimate emotional connection? Not do you like it, but is it meaningful in a way to you that you are suffering? It's a really weird question. Again, I'm not sure that one learns from Yochanan in this story how to be a good pastor. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, Rabbi Yochanan teaches us a lot about how not to be a good pastor. There's a beautiful love song titled Habibi. Yeah, there you go. Very common word in Arabic and Hebrew that means beloved. Okay, so sorry, my screen is wiggling a little bit. It's on a laptop stand that's not quite stable. Okay, so just pulling it back up. Is your suffering dear to you? Rabbi, do you desire to be ill and afflicted? Well, nobody desires it. I mean, what is that? Munchausen's. All right, well, we won't go into the exceptions to the rule. Well, you were going to say something, Aaron. What is it? No, okay. Is your suffering dear to you? Do you desire to be ill and afflicted? Rabbi Chia said to him, I welcome neither this suffering nor its reward. This is, again, this is going to come up like a refrain in these stories. So these stories have the trappings of folklore, right? They're told in a way that's clearly designed to inculcate life lessons and mnemonically be easy to memorize. So no, I welcome neither the suffering nor its reward. And that, of course, requires that you know a lot about what we've just read over the last several weeks, as one who welcomes this suffering with love is rewarded. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, give me your hand. Rabbi Chia bar Abba gave him his hand, and Rabbi Yochanan stood him up. Now, the traditional interpretation is that means he restored him to health. I've never fully bought that. It just means he stood him up. Not in the sense of standing a person up like for a date. It means he got him to sit upright or he got him to get out of bed. Hold this story in mind. I want to look at all of the meises first, and then we'll talk about them. So that's the first one. And it almost seems as if some editor had like a database or scraps of parchment with very similar stories and chose to include variations on a theme here, right? So if you like music and you listen to some Beethoven or Bach or Mozart, they often engage in a musical form called theme and variations. I don't think I need to explain it. It's when you present a musical theme and you present variations on it, but it's clearly the same basic idea coming up in varied ways. Okay, next story. Similarly, Rabbi Yochanan fell ill. All right, does this happen right after? We don't know. In other words, that's why I think that these are folkloric scraps of parchment, little post-it notes that the rabbis were just keeping around, and some redactor of the Talmud strung them all together. And it's really powerful to see them together. So in one version of the story, in one of the variations on a theme, it's Yochanan himself who gets sick. So the first variation is his pupil gets sick. Now he gets sick. Rabbi Hanina entered to visit him. You want to know who he is? Click here. Rabbi Hanina. It says, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing and that I am going to silence you. Oh, it's my favorite friend, Scam Likely. Do you get that on your phone? It's a call from Scam Likely. No, thank you. Okay, so Rabbi Hanina, this guy, really? Oh, it just says Tanaim of the third generation. Well, that doesn't help me so much. All right, never mind. Rabbi Hanina doesn't really want me to, or maybe, oh, wait. Yes, it's probably this other fellow. Sorry, I found it. The problem is, there are only so many names to go around, so there's more than one Rabbi Hanina. Fifth generation, Amora, maybe? Not clear. Not clear, because the text wants us to present somebody who has a relationship with Rabbi Yochanan, who we just learned lived from 250 to 290. Well, okay, not important. Rabbi Yochanan fell ill. Rabbi Hanina entered to visit him and said to him, is your suffering dear to you? Remember how I said this is like a little musical refrain. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, I welcome neither the suffering nor its reward. In other words, no, thank you very much. I'd rather be healthy. Rabbi Hanina said to him, give me your hand. He gave him his hand, and Rabbi Hanina stood him up. And that's all it says. And the Aramaic word for stood him up is v'okmei, from the Hebrew root kum. Lakum means to stand. V'okmei, he caused him to stand. Does that mean he restored him to health, or he just lent a hand? We don't know. Third Maisa. Then there's an interjection, which is one of the most famous lines in the whole Talmud, by the way. Amai, why? Lokim Rabbi Yochanan lenafshe. Why? In other words, just why, period. Why did Rabbi Yochanan wait for Rabbi Hanina to restore him to health? If he was able to heal his student, let Rabbi Yochanan stand himself up. Because we just had a passage where Yochanan was able to heal someone else just by taking his hand, get him to stand up. Why couldn't he do that for himself when he was sick? That's what they're asking. And this is the famous line I'm referring to. The Gemara answers with a koan, like a Zen saying, Ein chavush matir atzmo mi beit ha'asurim. A prisoner cannot free himself from prison. This is one of the most psychologically insightful things the Babylonian Talmud offers us, by the way. Just because you're good at helping somebody else doesn't mean that you're good at helping yourself. Put another way, doctors make the worst patients, rabbis make the worst congregants. Many therapists are in therapy and give good therapy because they themselves need therapy and have understood that that's just how it works. Often I will have to caution people when I'm counseling them, do as I say, not as I do. Because the prisoner cannot free himself from prison. It's an extraordinary statement. I hope it will stay with you. Yochanan was great at healing other people, but when he himself fell sick, somebody else had to come in to help him. Okay, Michelle and Steve in that order, please.
Are we going to an option as a reason for suffering is to enable someone else to have the blessing of helping?
I believe that is one feasible interpretation of this entire passage, or at least the culmination of this passage. However, and again, showing my hand here, not to reduce suspense, but just to keep us going and so that nobody loses the thread here. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that by the end of this passage, my belief is that the Talmud is not any longer primarily concerned with why we suffer. It shifts its focus from why to now what. It's going to shift its focus from, okay, we suffer. What are we going to do about it? How you make meaning out of that is very much, I think, a personal endeavor. But that's what I want to kind of use your comment / question, Michelle, as a jumping off point. But I think that your comment simply is going to hold our attention as we make our way to the conclusion of the passage. Thank you. Steve.
So throughout this whole section, I can't stop thinking about Job, because it seems to me that the rabbis can't really struggle with this without somehow being in conversation with that solution. And it seems to me that they're really now focusing on the friends who were not helpful.
I completely agree, even though he is not referenced directly. And I think that in this whole long passage, 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, we've been looking at the same section, Berakhot 5a and 5b. This is our third consecutive, although we were disrupted for a couple of weeks, third consecutive class on just 1 page or 1.5 pages of Talmud. The specter of Job hovers over all of this, even though there are extensive biblical citations in the first part on page 5a. I think one of them might have been from Job, but I'm not sure. Therefore, I'll just say, at least implicitly, Job hovers over this entire section of the Talmud. 100% agree. Trish.
I'm not quite following why, if Yochanan, sorry, excuse my voice, I'm getting over a bad cold. If he has spent so much time thinking about why people suffer, why he just rejects it all in the case of himself, and he just says, no, I don't accept this. I don't like it, and I don't think there's any purpose to it. I mean, that feels to me like what he's saying.
Fascinating, right? It may simply point out that there's a real difference when it's not you, or when you're the one who's the patient. All the theological answers that you as a rabbi have offered others to comfort them have gone out the window. The final variation on the theme that we're about to start brings all of this home. Okay, so again, I'm not convinced that these are 3 separate episodes that happened. In fact, I'm sure they're not. This is folklore. And I love the fact that the Gemara chose to preserve all the variations on a theme and doesn't say, well, this is the definitive version. Don't get hung up on which one really happened, or was Yochanan the patient? Was he the rabbi? Was it his student? Or in this case, the Gemara relates that Rabbi Elazar, another of Rabbi Yochanan's students, fell ill. Now, is it possible that poor Rabbi Yochanan, in addition to his own having buried 10 children, all of his students just keep getting sick? Maybe. Or maybe these are just variations on a folkloric theme that the Gemara chooses to preserve. Because, this is literature, right? That's how folk literature works. I do a class, it's been years since I taught it at WRT, but I'll bring it back someday, just stick around. But I teach a class on how to read Torah. I called it Torah 101. I developed it when I was a brand new rabbi. It was like the first curriculum I ever taught after rabbinical school. I taught it at Temple Bethel in Rhode Island. And the very first class of Torah 101, we didn't look at any Torah. I handed out 4 different versions of Little Red Riding Hood to the class. And I didn't tell the class that they were holding 4 different versions. I just asked them to study Little Red Riding Hood in Chavruta. And there were probably 30 or 40 people, because I used to be more popular as a teacher. The students would study the text to each other, but I didn't tell them that they were looking at 4 different versions of the story. So you had a bunch of pairs with version 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I just asked them a bunch of questions. And they all agree that, there's a Little Red Riding Hood and she wears a red cloak, and there's a big bad wolf and Granny's house and all of that. But then things get weird. I'm like, okay, what did Little Red Riding Hood have in her basket? And some said, oh, it was biscuits and blackberry wine. Another one says it was butter and cream. A third one said, oh, it was juice. And there are all of these different weird variations. Oh, what did Red Riding Hood do in the forest before she made it to Grandma's house? One, she's playing with some squirrels. Another, she's chasing butterflies. A third one, she's smelling daisies. And then How the story ends gets really weird. In other words, theme and variations. This is how folklore develops. Then what I did was I handed out the final part of the exercise. I handed out the Brothers Grimm version. We all read it and were like, ah, that's the story I know. All of the details were in place. The ending is the same. And then you ask the question, well, why did this become the canonized version? It was not the first, by the way. And even the moral of the story is very different. If I were to ask you right now, what's the moral of Little Red Riding Hood, you would probably say, don't talk to strangers, or don't dilly-dally when your mom gives you, an assignment. But the original version of Little Red Riding Hood, which comes from 14th century Italy, was a cautionary tale to prepubescent girls to watch out for boys. All men are wolves. And in the original version of Red Riding Hood, the wolf undresses her, gets into bed with her, and then eats her at the end of the story. And then there's a long coda that says, look out, ladies, all men are wolves. That's the original Little Red Riding Hood. That is not the story that the Brothers Grimm told. It has a lot of the same details, but that's not their main message. Anyway, so the way in which folklore is adapted, adopted, shaped, changed, themed, and variations, right, is often overlooked. But every now and then, you have this incredible opportunity, as in the Gemara we're studying today, to study versions of the same story side by side. Usually the story that we're about to look at, the final version of the Maisa, is the one that's considered definitive. It puts all of the ideas together. So let's look at it. Rabbi Elazar Chalash. Rabbi Elazar got sick. Al Gabe Rabbi Yochanan. They all start the same way. Rabbi Yochanan, it's always the same Rabbi Yochanan. He's the protagonist. He went in to visit him. Chaza dehavaka game beveit afel. He walked in and saw that he was lying in a dark room. Beit afel. Not just dark, by the way. Choshech is darkness. Afela or afel means gloom. So the room was both physically dark, but also emotionally dark. This whole thing, by the way, is highly allegorical. So don't read it only at the pshat or literal level. Try and get into the words that might be metaphors or the allegorical way of reading it. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan walks in to visit his student, Rabbi Elazar, and the room is very dark. I'm going to pick up in the English. Rabbi Yochanan exposed his arm. So he rolls up like his garment, his toga, whatever he has, his cloak, and light radiated from his flesh, filling the house. But it doesn't actually say that. It just says, and light filled the house. So he exposed his arm. And remember, this is only a few passages after the idea of visible and invisible leprosy. So he unclothes, and now the room is light. He saw that Rabbi Elazar was crying. And he said to him, why are you crying? I'm going to skip over some of the interpolation. If you are weeping because you did not study as much Torah as you would have liked, we have learned one who brings a substantial sacrifice and one who brings a meager sacrifice have equal merit, as long as he directs his heart toward heaven. In other words, maybe you are upset that here you are sick, maybe even dying, and you're lamenting the fact that you just haven't learned as much Torah as you want. But don't worry, whether your sacrifice has been great or small, as long as the intention behind it was holy, you're good. This, by the way, is how not to pastor a sick patient 101. You don't go in there and just start blabbing at them. Why are you sad? Is it because of this? Is it because of that? Maybe you're sad because of this. But let's see what he does wrong before he gets it right. Maybe it's because you didn't study enough Torah. Here's the comforting wisdom. As long as you direct your heart toward heaven. If you are weeping because you lack sustenance, that is to say you were unable to earn a livelihood, as Rabbi Elazar was indeed quite poor, not every person merits to eat off of two tables, meaning to have both wealth and Torah, right? So you got the table of Torah. You're a great scholar. You are rich in Torah. You're poor in dollars. So you need not bemoan the fact that you are not wealthy. If you are crying over children who have died, look what I have. Here is the bone of the 10th son that I have buried. And now here's where Steinsaltz helps us. And suffering of that kind afflicts great people, and they are afflictions of love. All right, so how not to be a good pastor? Rabbi Yochanan goes in there. He does this weird thing with his arm. The room gets light. Turns on the light with his arm. That's a strange thing. We're going to talk about it. And then he says, oh, you're crying. Why are you crying? Is it because you didn't learn enough Torah? Don't worry about it. Is it because you're poor? Don't worry about it. Is it because you've buried children? Don't worry about it. I have too. Terrible pastor. But let's read on because things do change. Rabbi Elazar said to Rabbi Yochanan, this is the response, I am not crying over my misfortune, but rather over this beauty that will decompose in the earth. It's better in the Aramaic. Amarle, lahai shufra devale be'afra ka bachena. Literally, I am crying because of this beauty that will decay. Not clear what he's referring to, by the way. I am crying because of this beauty, shufra is beauty, divale ba'afra, which will crumble into dust. Divale be'afra, which will crumble into the dust. Ta bachena. That's why I'm crying. I'm going to read it again. This is the response. Lahai shufra divale ba'afra kai bachena. I am crying, or it's literally over this beauty that will crumble into dust. That is why I am crying. Amarle, this is Yochanan's response. Alda vadai ka bachet. Over that, you should certainly be crying. Uvicho tarvaihu. And both of them wept together. This is a really important Talmudic passage, and we're going to take the time to unpack it over the next 15 minutes. I just really want you to sit with what's happening, though. So Yochanan says, why are you crying? He says, is it this? Is it that? Is it this? Elazar doesn't even get a word in edgewise. Finally, when he's given room to speak, he says, I am crying because of this beauty that will crumble into the dust. Yochanan affirms, over that you certainly should be crying. Uvecho tarvaihu, and both of them cried together. Let's read on. Meanwhile, Rabbi Yochanan said, it's not really meanwhile, it's after a while. So they have a good cry together. After a while, Yochanan says, we're waiting for the refrain, aren't we? Here it is. Is your suffering dear to you? Chavivin alecha yisurin. Amarle, he says to him, lo hein velo scharan. Neither it nor its reward. Nothing about this suffering is happy for me, is good for me. I shouldn't say happy. Suffering is never happy, but I don't cherish any of this. And now the conclusion of the story and of the passage we're looking at today. Amarle, Rabbi Yochanan said, Hav li yadcha, give me your hand. Yehav le yadeh, he gave him his hand, ve'okmeh, and he raised him up. Now I'm going to share the story with you one more time, and then I'm going to ask you to talk about it. In what I believe is the definitive and final version of the Maisa, of the story of Rabbi Yochanan comforting the sick. Remember, there's the first one where it's his pupil, and it's very, very streamlined. He goes in, he gives him his hand, he raises him up. They always ask the question, is your suffering dear to you? Neither it nor its reward. Gives him his hand, he stands him up. The second version, Yochanan himself is the one who is sick. Somebody else comes to visit him. One of his students says, do you welcome your suffering? Neither it nor its reward. And they stand it up. Then the Gemara says, why didn't he heal himself? He's such a healer. Why didn't he just do it for himself? Because the prisoner cannot release himself from prison. Right? When you're on the inside, it's very different than when you're on the outside looking in. Then the final version of the story. Rabbi Elazar, another pupil of Rabbi Yochanan, gets sick. Yochanan goes in to visit him, sees that the room is dark. He unclothes his arm and the room is now light. He notices now that the room is light that his pupil is crying. He says, why are you crying? And before letting his pupil answer, he provides three possible explanations. He says, is it because you didn't learn enough Torah? Don't worry about it. As long as you were directing your heart in the right way, however much or little you learned is sufficient. Is it because you didn't earn enough to make a real strong living. In other words, you're not wealthy. Don't worry. If you have a richness of Torah, that's sufficient. Is it because you've buried children? Well, guess what? So have I. Here's the bone of my 10th son. Finally, when he shuts up, Rabbi Elazar says, I am crying because of this beauty that will crumble into the dust, whatever that may mean. Then Yochanan pauses and says, now over that, you should certainly be crying. And the two of them cry together. And then the final part of the passage is, after a while, Rabbi Yochanan looks at his pupil and says, is this suffering dear to you? We're waiting for it at this point. We know that's the refrain. Elazar answers exactly the way we know he's going to, neither it nor its reward. I do not welcome this suffering. Rabbi Yochanan says, give me your hand. He gives him his hand and he raises him up. And then the rabbis always comment, the traditional interpretation is that to raise him up means to heal him. I've never fully bought into that interpretation, but I'm in the minority, by the way. Any traditional rabbi will tell you Yochanan heals the sick. I'm not convinced that giving somebody your hand and standing them up means that they are healed of their illness. And now we have about 10 minutes to talk about this passage. And I can bring it back on screen if it's helpful, but we've now read it or summarized it several times. And I'd love to hear what it means to you, what it calls up for you, how you interpret it, what questions you still have about it. What do you think it's trying to tell us, Alan?
To me, the beauty that they're crying over is their relationship.
Say more.
They have a friendship. They love that, and it's going to end.
Yeah.
And that is a sad thing. That you have to say goodbye.
Thank you. Mom and Dad, you're next.
Hovering over all of this is, what kind of person would welcome the suffering? They keep asking that question, but who do the rabbis postulate would answer in the affirmative?
Well, the short answer is I don't know. The long answer is I have met some people who, while I would never say that they like their suffering, I've met some people whose self-identity is so bound up in their suffering that they are like the prisoner who can't release themselves from prison. In therapy language, one would ask of them, how is this feeding you? In other words, I know some people who constantly relate to themselves as victims in life. And it becomes a prison of their own making. I don't want to minimize the pain that some people who have experienced terrible bereavement feel, let's just say for the rest of their lives, right? There's a hole there that doesn't get filled. And at the same time, I have met other people who endure terrible bereavement, but are able to return to the joy and beauty of living. I meet other people who can never escape their bereavement. Years and years and years and years, and they're like the prisoner who can't leave the prison. So even if they would not admit, I like this suffering, there's something going on at the psychological level where it becomes their identity. And therefore they have become one with their suffering. They have embraced it. And I think what Yochanan is saying to his pupil here is, and what each of these texts is saying is, to some extent, suffering is a choice. Suffering is not only the things that happen to you that inflict pain. Suffering is the combination of the things that happen to you that inflict pain and your response to those things. Thank you. It's a really deep and probing question, and I would be both inaccurate and unwise to suggest that I have all the answers. But I am reflecting from 23 years of pastoring people that a lot of my experience, a lot of my comments here are shaped by that, and by being a person. Joe.
Apropos to this story, may I offer my hand to Trish, and hopefully the hand will restore her will lift her up and restore her to health. But some of my takeaways from that, I have several. One, I think the story of the continuing thing of the bone of his 10th child, I'm not sure whether it's just to commiserate with him or to say, I'm sharing my grief with you, and therefore let's go through this together.
I love that, Joe.
And that's one of the obligations of the pastor, as you said, and you committed to. But another thing is when Yochanan goes, or when he gets sick himself and he gets visited by a student or whatever, another rabbi, he adds to his own feeling about sharing this, sharing an illness, and he supports his own ideals about doing this in the future.
Beautiful.
And when he comes in the third portion, when he comes in and sheds a little bit of the light, I'm not sure it was the arm. I think it was allegorical a little bit. And he may have come into a house where the guy had his blinds closed and so on, and maybe just said, let's open the light, let's see each other, let's make this a daytime rather than a nighttime sort of thing. So
gorgeous, Joe. Beautiful comments.
Thank you.
Really beautiful. And I'll just jump off and use your comments as a springboard. First of all, thank you for your good wishes to Trish. This is why in the Jewish tradition, it is in the category of mitzvah, sacred obligation, to comfort the sick, to visit the sick. The Talmud will later say that visiting the sick takes away 1/60th of their illness, which is the rabbi's way. Don't read the actual number. It's not a real number. It means the smallest measurable portion of something, but it has an effect. It has an effect. The other thing I would say is, yes, does he have a light up arm, or is it simply that his physical presence has the effect of bringing light to a room that isn't just dark but gloomy? Yes. Thirdly, I love the idea that he carries around this bone not as a way of indulging his own suffering or as this morbid token of grief, but rather as a shared, it's a symbol for the shared bond of the shared kinship of terrible loss. I've had 2 moms in our community who've lost a loved one to a fentanyl overdose this year. One, a 23-year-old son, and the other, a 24-year-old nephew. And a week ago, I put them in touch with each other. I mean, their grief is now separated by many months. I wasn't going to do it the week afterward, but I said to both of them, would you be willing to talk to another person who's, going through the same thing? And they both said, absolutely. I'd love that. Not because misery loves company, but because comfort needs company. And there are some kinds of grief, by the way, that are worse than others. I had another member of the community who buried his 102-year-old grandmother last week. It was not like burying a 23-year-old. It's the exact opposite of that. It was really quite beautiful. It's sad, but beautiful. But burying a 23-year-old because of a fentanyl overdose is sad and horrific. There's nothing beautiful about it. Steve Maskett, you're next, please. Oh, unmute kindly, thank you.
So I'm struggling a bit with this because everything that's been said I love about this idea of being the support in some way, but here we have a situation where there is a response of crying, and it's explained, and then the formula is repeated as if but the crying is over decay. It's not over unless the decay is really the person's own sickness. They're not crying over themselves. So it's it's clear that the crying, I guess, is not accepted as the response of accepting the suffering.
Yeah, he just says this beauty which will crumble to dust. The traditional interpretation, by the way, is that he is referring to the mortality of his teacher, not to himself.
Mhm.
But I love Alan. I love Alan's comment. I mean, that was an interpretation that I haven't heard before, but I think it's beautiful. He's talking about the relationship. You know, if one of them dies, well, relationships don't end when somebody dies, by the way. But something does.
It changes. It changes.
Yeah. Great. I'm not here to answer your questions. We're really just doing open reflection. I think that this is one of those texts where I was first introduced to it as a rabbinical student. So we're going back, actually it was exactly 25 years ago. It was the spring of 98. I was teaching at the Melton Adult Mini School in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I learned this text for the first time as part of a class on Jewish ethics. And it's just one of those ones that burrowed itself so deeply inside of me that I don't think I've ever had a pastoral encounter where Rabbi Yochanan is not in the room with me. I go into a hospital and I think about Rabbi Elazar sitting in the dark, and I recognize that I should shut up and just let the light of my presence be the thing that gets the encounter going. But I'm sure it will sit with you for at least as long as it has with me, and I hope it will make a difference in the way you think about life. But we'll hear a few other comments. Judy, and then
Can I just add one more thing? I'm wondering whether it's saying that the welcoming of the suffering is not the goal.
Right. Yes, I think it is saying that the goal of a Jewish life is I don't know if transcending suffering is right, because transcend implies to go over, and the only way out is through. As my Rabbi Les Gutterman once said, of the reason that the Psalm speaks of, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, because that's the only way you get to the other side. You don't get to go around it. You go through it. Having said that, you can't dwell in the valley of the shadow forever, or you shouldn't. I think there is kind of a moral imperative that you have to find a way to keep living. And if that means you have a good cry over the beauty that will crumble, that seems to me a signal that they have both accepted that the real shadow hovering over this entire passage is mortality itself. That is suffering. Once you accept that as the universal condition of being a human, that is the key that unlocks your ability to transcend or move through. Judy.
Again, so many things too that are in my mind. One is when he brings someone up who is suffering, they're helping to stand. And to me, the standing is a symbol of strength. You need strength to deal with your suffering. And that I have had occasion to. I think Rabbi Jacob referred me when we were suffering from my poor infertility in our family. Rabbi Jacob sent me to a book of poems, but a lot of it was, you need strength to deal. There's no actual answer. The other thing is, my son-in-law's Hindu mother, who was an amazing doctor and scholar, gave me that same advice, that if you have an obstacle, you don't fight it, you have to go through it, and you have to reach the other side. And the other thing that I think that is brought to mind is the Shiva that we experience. What is Shiva other than helping people who are suffering and having this whole Joe's explanation also of shared kinship of
Thank you.
Having, that's a major.
And you know the first rule of Shiva: you show up, you don't talk. You don't talk unless you're spoken to. Traditionally, I mean, obviously you're going to schmooze, but you don't have to say anything to comfort the mourner. You stand. I mean, that's why COVID was. I think COVID's hardest effect was actually on Shiva.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was the biggest loss that I experienced at the level of what happened in our community. I think the greatest pain that was inflicted by COVID, other than COVID, was no homes being open for Shiva. Doing an online memorial proved to be surprisingly comforting for people, and for me, by the way.
Can I just tell you how amazing our Shiva was? For Ivan, 170 people were on our call. They were in India, they were in Israel, they were in, so.
I was in Santa Monica.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was a most beautiful and comforting something that is leaving me with great comfort. So there you go.
In a world where you can't give your arm or, stand another person up, but how much we really need each other. And Judaism is a tradition of showing up for other people. Beautiful, Judy. Let's hear from Trish, and then I'll say a concluding thought.
First of all, thanks, Joe, for your wishes for healing. Thank goodness it's just a bad cold. So when I'm looking at these three stories we're reading, which are really, really similar, I mean, two of them are practically identical except for the characters. The third one, though, so, one of these things is not like the other. What's different about that third one? And it's remarkable what the differences are, but I just don't understand what they mean. So there's a dark room, which is interesting. There's, the light up arm, which is really interesting. I like to interpret that as the light of his presence, as you said, to get the encounter going. But then what does he do? He doesn't ask, well, he says, why are you crying? And then he just gives all the wrong answers.
Yeah.
So I just don't understand why that section is in there. I mean, it's very enlightening, but it ends up in the same. Why didn't he ask the same question that he asked in the other stories? The first question was the one that was the key to the healing. And why is this story so different? I don't understand yet, but then.
Yeah, I both live inside of and share the exact same discomforts around the story. And at the same time, I've read this so many times, the bungling way in which Yochanan is described here is, to me, the most illuminating and endearing part of the whole story. And it's very Jewish. It's very Talmudic. I think that a deliberate effort is made not to turn Yochanan into a superhero. Like, actually, as a pastor, he still has a long way to go. But he learns it by shutting up for 1 minute. There is this moment where finally the student becomes the teacher, and Elazar says, well, are you done with your theological posturing about why you think I'm suffering? Maybe if you just shut up for 1 minute, I'll tell you. And the answer is, because of this beauty that will crumble into the dust, that is why I am crying. And there's this beautiful line where Yochanan says, oh yes, that makes sense. Over that, you certainly should be crying. And the two of them cried together is the most important line in the whole story, right? It's just pure empathy. There are no words. And then you get the coda. It's such an elegantly told story, though, but it's a story that doesn't miss the opportunity to humanize Yochanan, because from the other two stories, you would think he's just a miracle worker. He walks in and he heals the sick. And in this case, it's not about that. His healing power doesn't come from Yochanan being an especially qualified super figure. And by the way, people impute a lot to the healing power of the rabbi. I need the rabbi to come to the hospital. If he says the right prayer and incantation, maybe my mom will get better. It doesn't work that way. I can only do what Yochanan eventually figures out, which is just show up. And maybe sometimes have a good cry together. And maybe give them your hand. It's the best we can do. But there's this beautiful reckoning where they both learn something. They both learn that persisting in suffering or releasing one from suffering is, at least to some extent, a choice we can make. And it's a gift we can give each other too. Joe, do you want to offer a final word here? Unmute though. Unmute if you're going to. Nope, you're still muted, my friend. There you go. Oh, you remuted. My bad. I asked you to unmute and you clicked it. I'm sorry. There you go.
Okay. I want to get back to something Judy said, reminded me of something, but I want to mention about the pastoral situation. When I was in hospital, it was after my heart surgery in 1995, Rabbi Jacobs called me, and it meant so much. And we all know that. We all know what the Shiva means and so on. After I hung up, I cried, but I think I felt better.
Yeah.
I think it helped me. I'm sure it did, and I know it. Anyway, something that Judy said about the Shiva. She said 170 people were there. I'm sure there were more people who would have loved to have been there, who are with her, whether they're there in body or not. They're there in spirit, because I know I missed it, but Judy knows how much I love her and how much I loved Yvonne. So I think that's
all
something
of
to
us,
consider.
those of us who have been studying together for a long time, still feel Yvonne's presence and his wisdom and his piercing intellect and curiosity in this space. So grateful for that remembrance, Joe. So, my friends, we'll do a concluding session next week, as Monty Python would say, now for something completely different. We'll stay on our main subject, but we're going to look at a different passage entirely. This has been a 3-week, almost 5 hours on a page and a half of Talmud, but that's how you do Talmud. And what a gift it is to have the beauty of your presence. So I look forward to sharing more study with you, and I hope I get to see you in person. I can't even tell you where to begin, but look at the weekly e-blast and go to the temple website, because we have so much happening at WRT this month. And I will wish you an early Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, my friends.
Kol hakavod, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Early Shabbat Shalom to you. Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom, and thank you.